Hi, everyone who's joining. We're going to wait another minute for the rest of the participants and viewers to roll in, and then we'll get started. So just a minute. Okay, so we'll get started. First off, thank you all for joining. We're really excited about this event, and we're really excited with the partnership with the Clough Center that has allowed this project to get off the ground. So thank you to the Clough Center and to its director, Professor Rougeau. I'd also like to thank Dean Rougeau and our panelists for helping us out with this event and participating. I'd also like to thank the myriad of faculty, student groups, and grassroots organizations that have helped support this project and make it a reality. I definitely would like to thank the leadership team of the Good Governance Project, which is this initiative at BC. And last, I would like to thank the students, the BC, JD, and LLM students who will be forming into working groups, currently in the process of that, and studying and advocating for democracy reform this year. These issues of democracy reform are critical. These rules are so important. The rules that govern our political system, the quality of those rules are important. The underlying values are important. And of course, the product of government and these policies are important. The rules can be improved. And the panelists today will tell you about how these rules can be improved, why they need to be improved, and the exciting efforts underway to do just that. So without further ado, I will pass the virtual microphone to Dean Rougeau, and we will begin.
Well, thank you so much, Matt, and welcome. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be with you here today for this kickoff of the Good Governance Project and our its inaugural panel. I can't think of a more important topic right now than good governance, so I'm really pleased to be a part of this as we approach, probably for many of us, one of the most consequential elections in our lifetimes, at least at the presidential level. I think it's really important and really encouraging to see the extraordinary engagement of our students here at BC Law around the issue of reform. Democracy, I think we're all beginning to understand, if we didn't understand before, isn't just a theoretical concept if you want it to work. It's a way of governing, a way of living in civil society and political life together that requires real meaningful engagement and real understanding of the processes that make it work. And as Matt mentioned, from time to time, we need to take a close look at the process, and we need to ask whether or not it needs to be changed. We need to take close looks at the rules and ask ourselves if the rules really are working. So we've got a wonderful panel to help us dive into this topic in more detail. And we're very pleased to welcome them here to BC virtually. I will introduce each of them in just a moment, but before I do that, I want to just give you a little sense of how our time together will proceed. So as I said, I'll introduce each of the panelists in the order in which they will be speaking, and then I will open things up with our first panelist. After each panelist speaks for about 6, 7, 8 minutes or so, I will pose a question or two based on what they've discussed, and we'll go through the panel that way. And at the end of the panel, I will open it up for a more general discussion with the panelists with a few more questions. And then we'll have time after that for Q&A from the audience, and we're looking forward to that discussion as well. So you will be able to use the Q&A function in Zoom to pose your questions, and Matt and I will work together to filter and ask the questions as best we can. I'm hoping there'll be a lot of them, so bear with us as we try to go through them, and we'll do our best to get to as many of your questions as possible. So thanks once again for being here, and with that, let me introduce our panel. So our first panelist is Jamie Eldridge, who is a Massachusetts State Senator from the Middlesex and Worcester District. He's a graduate of BC Law and the Senate Chair of the Judiciary Committee and the Vice Chair of the Election Laws Committee. Jamie Eldridge previously served 3 terms in the Massachusetts House of Representatives, where he sat on the Joint Committee on Community Development and Small Business, the Joint Committee on Election Law, and the Joint Committee on Public Service. Our next panelist is Jeff Clements, an attorney and author of Corporations Are Not People, Reclaiming Democracy from Big Money and Global Corporations. Jeff is also the founder and president of American Promise, a group seeking a constitutional amendment for campaign finance reform. In his 3-decade legal career in public service and private practice, he has been a partner in a major Boston law firm and has served as Assistant Attorney General in Massachusetts. In 2012, he founded Whaleback Partners LLC, which provides sustainable financing to businesses in the local agricultural economy in New England. Jeff has helped to start and been a board member of many nonprofit organizations and businesses. Our next panelist is Zach Wamp. Zach Wamp served in the House of Representatives, U.S. House of Representatives for 16 years, representing Tennessee's 3rd District. He served as the ranking member of the Military Construction Veterans Affairs Subcommittee, and prior to that as the ranking member of the Legislative Branch Subcommittee of the House Appropriations Committee, which he served on for 14 years. Zach helped establish the Department of Homeland Security and the Tennessee Valley Technology Corridor. He signed discharge petitions and closed the debate on the House floor of the most significant political reform legislation in a generation. He is an advisor to Issue One, a nonpartisan democracy reform organization, and is co-chair of their Reformers Caucus. And our final panelist is Sara Eskrich. Sara is the Executive Director of Democracy Fund and a former city councilor in Madison, Wisconsin. Sara's work focuses on Final Five and ranked choice voting, 2 voting reform schemes that may realign electoral incentives for public servants so that they can better work towards results in the public interest, and something I know a lot of people in Massachusetts are thinking a lot about these days as well. So with that, I will begin with Jamie Eldridge. Thanks so much.
Great. Well, Dean Rougeau, thank you very much for that kind introduction, and very pleased to be on this panel with Jeff Clements, former Councilor Wamp, and Sara Eskrich. And really want to thank, on the BC Law side, for students for political responsibility, and Matt Victor and Julia with the Clough Center for Constitutional Democracy at BC on the sort of kickoff of the Good Governance Project. And as Dean Rougeau mentioned, I am a proud graduate of BC Law and was very active in a lot of civic institutions at BC Law, and arguably spend more time on those civic institutions than my classes. But I hope hopefully it served me well to get me interested in politics and to run for office. And I've served for 18 years now in the legislature, and have been very active on a lot of democratic reforms. When I first ran for the legislature, Massachusetts had something called the Clean Elections Law, so publicly financed elections. and I was the only candidate that year to run and win, being publicly financed. So I really saw the direct value of getting big money out of politics. And that really caused me to, zero in on, that as an issue, is that, if you take money out of politics, there can be a greater focus on issues. If there can be more transparency, then I think there's a greater ability to get to a consensus on public policy. And just that there needs to be, more engagement with the voters in general, as well as, more competition, and that can be public finance, that can be ranked choice voting, which very happy that that's on the ballot in Massachusetts this year. And I was the author of one of the first ranked choice voting bills last session, but very happy that's going to be a referendum item. As well as I have filed a bill to create an independent redistricting commission for redistricting for House and Senate state seats, as well as congressional seats in Massachusetts, which is a growing movement across Massachusetts. I think what I would just, emphasize, I don't want to go into too much detail with the different, bills that I've filed, but, first of all, I would just say that in terms of sort of political responsibility for voters, for residents, for citizens is, I think, first of all, there just needs to be, a greater confidence in government. And I think that, is partly accomplished through transparency, as well as just clear communication about what government does. And so I think, some of the legislation I've filed, whether it's getting big money out of politics, whether it's creating this independent redistricting commission, whether it's, some transparency legislation, is that yeah, government is very confusing, and elected officials need to do everything possible to more clearly explain what is going on with government, and also the reasons for our decisions. I am more on the progressive Democratic side, represent a fairly purple legislative district of about 140,000 people. And I truly find that, my being upfront about, where I stand on issues, my focus on getting, big money out of politics and not taking, corporate money, that my ability to interact with constituents who might disagree with me on issues, but support me because they know where I'm coming from, and they see a level of transparency. So I think there's a value in that. And then I think in terms of, engaging more voters, from a good government point of view, is that these reforms that I know fellow panelists are very involved with I think really are designed to get more people involved. You look at ranked choice voting, one of the key benefits of it is avoiding the spoiler effect of a third party, taking away enough votes from one of the major parties. And I think more parties is great, but that our current system really just causes most voters to say, I've got to make a choice between Democrat or Republican. If there's the opportunity for third-party candidates to talk about their ideas, that enriches the discussion. And ranked choice voting not only allows the person who wins to get a majority of votes, but allows a more robust discussion and their inclusion of voters that might have different ideas. I think that's a really healthy thing. And I think on the Independent Redistricting Commission constitutional amendment that I filed, is that that is an example where a lot of voters feel disenfranchised because of the way their districts are made up. There are some communities where it's just one precinct or one ward, and realistically, no one from that town or city can run for office, and so that's automatically going to cause the residents in that community to be less engaged. And I see that in my communities that are split with other legislative districts. So I think that that's really critical to have, a separate process, a more transparent process, and really trying to find different ways for elected officials to send a message that we care about voters' ideas. We want them to be engaged. They want them to hold us accountable. And these different reforms are critical to a more robust democracy. And as Dean Rougeau said, I can't think of a better time for this good governance project to kick off and to have this discussion. And I find more often than not, these discussions are very bipartisan in Massachusetts. So it's not just one party, and it's an area we can create consensus and make some real progress. So honored to be on this panel, and thanks for inviting me.
Well, thanks so much, Senator Eldridge. Let me pose a couple questions your way. You were speaking about some of the ways that we might improve our democracy, particularly by getting money out of the process and through perhaps redistricting reform. What do you see as other key or important barriers that we're facing in terms of reforming our democratic system?
Yeah, I would say that other other barriers is that I think the legislative process continues to be very confusing. It's a bit of an exaggeration, but I would say maybe every week I get a question from a generally very well-informed voter saying, what's it like to work in Washington, D.C., and what's your commute to D.C., not knowing that I'm a state legislator. I just think that there needs to be, a lot more transparency about what the legislative process is. I've had a frustration that the legislature, more often than not, sort of finds ways to obscure the process, and it just causes some people who want to be engaged to just, shut down. So I think there needs to be a clear explanation of the process and how people get engaged. We passed a major police reform bill at the end of July, the House and Senate, and I'm hoping it'll become law. But the hearing process, the quick time, turnaround time for the bill to be drafted, left a lot of people that might have supported the bill, but they thought the process was very rushed and there wasn't a lot of transparency. I think those are things that legislative bodies or other government bodies can fix. They just need to invest the resources, and I think elected officials need to be more engaged in explaining that legislative process.
Well, you sort of anticipated another thing I was thinking about. It's interesting how disconnected people can often feel from their state government. You can sort of understand why it might be the case from the federal government or from the Congress in Washington. But even in a state that's relatively small, like Massachusetts, at least geographically, people really don't know how their state government functions or how to engage the process. So I was glad to hear you raise that. I guess sort of piggybacking on that a bit. Do you have some other thoughts on how we might do this better, and how have you found, or when you think about reforming our democracy, particularly say at the state level, how do you see this as helping you in terms of moving forward the issues that are most important to you as a legislator?
Yeah, well, I would really double down on campaign finance reform and special interests more often than not, corporate special interests. And I'm so happy to be on this panel with Jeff Clements, because when the Supreme Court Citizens United decision came down, the two of us partnered to pass legislation in Massachusetts, not only calling for the U.S. Congress to overturn that, but actually passing a bill for disclosure, so that if corporations were spending money in Massachusetts races, they had to at least disclose money had to be disclosed. And I just think that when I think of the battles at the State House, I just think that more often than not, it's the money behind different groups for or against the bill that really hurt its prospects. I've been a sponsor for many years of an environmental justice bill that really is a very common sense bill, just making sure that poor communities and communities of color have more of a say and more of a voice when a fossil fuel project or other project is proposed in a community. You know, really, in my opinion, a fairly modest bill, but the corporate sort of, you know, developers, real estate entities, very opposed to it, very active on the fundraising front, and I, you know, feel that, you know, more often than not that gives them a greater power to defeat that legislation. So campaign finance, I think, is really critical, and I would love to get back to public finance and the clean elections law that benefited me when I first ran for office.
Great, thanks so much. Jeff
Thank
Clements, let me turn to you.
Well, thank you, Dean, and thanks to everybody at the Clough Center and the Good Governance Project. Matt, congratulations on this launch. It's really exciting to be here for us at American Promise, for me. And thank you, Senator, for all your leadership and your early work after the Citizens United decision to build the cross-partisan national effort, starting in Massachusetts and many other states, for a constitutional amendment to enable us to deal with that campaign finance and money in politics problem. That's what I'd like to talk about today. Great to be here with Congressman Wamp too. Hello, and Sara Eskrich as well. So thanks for joining us, everybody. I'd like, last couple of weeks ago now, we celebrated Constitution Day, September 17th, and I want to share some thoughts on how governance and we, the people, have to periodically dust off our constitutional amendment muscles if we are going to be celebrating Constitution Days in the future. It's a recognition of the anniversary of the completion of the Constitution in Philadelphia, September 17th, 1787, that we celebrate on Constitution Day. But of course, that work of the Constitution was just beginning. Almost immediately, we amended the Constitution with the Bill of Rights, and we haven't stopped since. So I want to talk about why it is my belief, and many others, that we are in a constitutional amendment moment again in America, and we're going to reset some of our foundational principles that will enable a lot more progress on good governance in America. So if I would, if I can, I'll share my screen, and it looks like, Julie, I may need some help. It's host disabled participant screen sharing. So if you could enable me, I will show some slides. Looks like I can. So, okay, let me just share some slides and I'll move quickly through them. So the power of constitutional amendments, as I said, I'll put our website in the chat as I finish up, so you can check it out, AmericanPromise.net. We're a cross-partisan national organization with members in every state, Republicans, Democrats, Independents, working together to actually get 2/3 of Congress to pass the constitutional amendment, enabling us to have reasonable limits around money in our political system, and then have it ratified in 38 states. I know I'm talking to BC law, so you all knew that about how we ratify the Constitution, why we're doing it. This is the kind of government I think we want, the kind of country we want, where everyone's voice matters, government listens, lots of debate, lots of candidates, lots of ideas, plenty of money to distribute those ideas, but it's not coming from concentrated sources. It's coming from a lot of people. Problem solved, represented constituents instead of chasing donors. Essentially the promise of America: liberty, opportunity, and in the words of those crazy hippies of 1776, pursuing happiness is what we envision. Now imagine America without constitutional amendments. It's a different kind of country. No Bill of Rights, no ban on slavery, no due process, no equal protection, no rights for women to vote, people of color to vote, no election of senators. Zach Wamp might like this: no progressive income tax, but we had to do a constitutional amendment to have a progressive income tax. And we had to do a constitutional amendment to eliminate poll taxes, a barrier to voting for so many, and no term limits for presidents, and other things that we did only because of amendments. When do we do them? In moments just like we live in now, moments of crisis, moments of despair, moments of great doubt about the American experiment, moments of chaos. Amendments happen when an incessant demand for what the American promise is all about runs into an immovable roadblock on the Supreme Court. And we get constitutional amendments, exactly what we are seeing right now. 8 of our amendments reversed Supreme Court decisions that had locked in anachronistic constitutional principles that no longer worked for good governance, that excluded too many Americans who had every right to be part of this American experiment. And constitutional amendments ensued, not easily, but because they were necessary, because the moment had come, because they were ready. So that's the background on amendments. And we, as I said, I think we're in one of those moments now. The cartoon on the right, maybe your left, if you represent special interests, I can see you immediately, resonates with virtually every American. That's equality. It's not about, determining equality of outcomes or material goods or anything. It's that basic fairness that every American feels, that, there should not be a special access for some citizens in our political process. What is the barrier? That's what the Commission on the Practice of Democratic Citizenship out of the Academy of Arts and Sciences recently called an urgent threat to our democratic way of life. It's concentrated power of money, because the Supreme Court disabled our ability to have limits on how money's used in our political system. 30% of the super PAC money coming from 6 donors. That's 6, not 6%, not 6, not 6 million. It's 6 donors. 25 individuals accounting for nearly half the money. Look at this, how Americans feel. We're cross-partisan. This problem is cross-partisan. This solution is cross-partisan. It's 2016 out of the University of Maryland, project Voice of the People. Angry Trump supporters, almost 100%. Angry Clinton supporters, almost 100%. And almost everybody else feeling that when they went to the polls in 2016, they felt like government represents a few big interests and is not looking out for the good of the people. Whoever the 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 or 6% were who didn't think that in 2016, I think they probably do now. So this constitutional amendment will fix it. American Promise is on the job, but American Promise is you and every American. We have, as I said, Republicans, Democrats, Independents, U.S. senators, formerly like Al Simpson and Olympia Snow, and on the Democratic side, our own Governor Mike Caucus and Nina Turner and many others. Here's what the amendment will do. I'm going to move quickly over this. I'll put a report, our Constitution Day report in, would welcome the brainpower of Boston College Law School, giving us feedback on a proposed amendment that just came out of the Citizen Commission in Massachusetts, on which I had the privilege of serving with others, that created this recommended language after 2 years of hearings and expert testimony. I'm going to move quickly over the language, but again, I'll put the report in the chat, and we look forward to your feedback. Essentially, Congress, the states, we the people have the power to enact limits on how money is used in the political system, subject to the First Amendment, of course. This is about not amending the First Amendment. It's fixing the First Amendment, strengthening it by weighing the compelling interests of anti-corruption, political equality, federalism, and other key constitutional values that the Supreme Court ignores. As I said, massive cross-partisan support. Republicans, Democrats want this. And it's happening. Senator Eldridge mentioned Massachusetts enacting a resolution calling for the amendment, a cross-partisan resolution, virtually unanimous. That has happened now in 20 states. And there's a resolution, actually, congressmen in the Tennessee legislature moving as well. We hope Tennessee, Alaska, Wyoming, and other states team this up, will become 21 and 22 and 23, keeping this constitutional amendment moving. That's how we get the votes in Congress. That's how we've gotten massive support on the Democratic side, 220 House members, 47 senators, and it's how we're going to get the cross-partisan will to have a Republican amendment introduced, cross-partisan amendment introduced, and we will help bridge and close that gap to make sure we get the 2/3 of Congress ratification in 3/4 of the states. So I'll stop there. As I said, I'll put a couple of links in the chat, one to our website, one to our report that we issued on Constitution Day. We would welcome your feedback. You can sign up at AmericanPromise.net or just get in touch with me. I will stop there. So thanks. So glad to be here with you all. And I don't know if I left any time for a question or two, Dean, but I would be happy to answer any questions.
Thanks so much. No, this is really a fascinating presentation, and I think the slides were really helpful in giving us a sense of the work that you're doing. You know, I guess one issue that comes to my mind as I think about this is we've seen in the past, you know, we've had in, I guess, modern times, obviously the amendment that springs to mind is the ERA, and the length of time it took to get that moving through the states, even though in its early days it had tremendous support, at least the political support seemed to be there, but then over time, events and changes in I guess conditions, maybe economic, social, and others, slowed it down. How do you avoid sort of some of the pitfalls that you saw from these previous attempts, and how do you keep things moving?
Yeah, that's such a great question, and it's why we formed American Promise. We launched January 2016 to solve those exact problems. We looked at how amendments had actually been won and how they'd been lost in American history, and the key lessons to learn are you need to be ready when the historic moment comes. Often amendments have been 40, 50 years in the works. That was true when 18, 19, 20-year-olds got the right to vote. That had Harry Truman tried to get that amendment done during World War II, and it happened in 1971 in the height of the Vietnam War when Americans were being drafted to serve and did not have a vote. The women's right to vote for 50, 60 years. It happened when in 1919, ratified in Tennessee with one vote to spare. Now what we saw, Dean, in answer to your question about what happened to the ERA and others that didn't make it, is there is a moment when people, the national will coalesces around overwhelming consensus that it needs to be done. And almost every single amendment, once it went through Congress, which often took years in the making, but once it got passed by Congress, the ratification on average is around 1 to 2 years. Almost all the amendments were ratified 1 to 2 years. One exception, which is an interesting footnote, our most recent, the 27th, but almost all of them. Now the ERA had a time limit, a 7-year time limit, and then that was renewed once, but there's no constitutional requirement for a time limit. That's being litigated now, actually, about whether the ERA can still yet be ratified. But I think that's the point, is this amendment that we are talking about has been 40, 50 years in the making. This did not start with Citizens United. This went back to Buckley versus Vallejo after the post-Watergate reforms. Vice President Joe Biden first co-sponsored a constitutional amendment like this with John McCain. Mitch McConnell was in favor of this constitutional amendment before he wasn't anymore years ago. That was in the 90s. And so this has been a long time in the making, and I think the moment is now. And so what we are built to do is create what's very hard and unusual in this country right now, a place and a way for Americans of widely different views, of divided opinion, divided politics, to join together to seize this moment of national consensus and lock in a constitutional foundation, not to answer all the questions, but to enable us to get better answers in the future to how money and economic power should or could be or should not be leveraged in the political sphere. So I think that's the key, is know that you have to have your historic moment, and you better be ready when it comes. And we're about being ready. We think we'll get the vote in Congress at the beginning of 24, and we'll have it ratified by July 4th, 2026, the American celebration of 250 years since the Declaration of Independence.
That's terrific. Thanks so much. Zach Wamp, let me turn to you.
Well, thank you. It's a real privilege to be with all of you. Dean and Matthew, thank you for your perseverance on putting this together, and all the participants there. It's an honor to be on screen with each of you. Sara, thanks for what the Democracy Fund does at Issue 1. We're really grateful for your continued support. Senator Eldridge, big fan of your state and your willingness to step out, regardless of your ideology, step out and do the right thing for the people of Massachusetts and the country. And Jeff Clements, if I had your hair, I might have been the president of the United States. You look good. There hadn't been a bald president in a long time, so I was out. I'll make some general observations. If you kind of want to know who I am, I was elected in class of '94 after a long involvement in frankly partisan political activity. The two-party system kind of got me interested early, but for the last 25 years, I've been disgusted by the two-party system and how everything is all politics all the time, not near enough policy, not near enough due diligence on behalf of Congress, and became really a nonpartisan, more through my service than a partisan. So it's really changed a lot in my 40 years of involvement. Some people call me John McCain's wingman because I was the Republican that led Shays Meehan through the House and closed the debate on the House floor because I felt like it was transcendent. We got above the two parties, and even President George Bush signed that into law. And while it wasn't perfect and it had flaws, it at least showed that we were willing as a nation to address our problems. And today we're not. But before we even get to this topic, let me just say to everyone, Rome is burning right now. The most important thing we can all be involved in is this election. I don't mean voting or who wins. I mean getting it done and making sure we have a peaceful transfer of power after everyone that's qualified and lawful in this country gets to vote in however manner they want to. I'll cheat a little bit and tell you that this weekend you'll see rolled out the National Council on Election Integrity. It's about 40 people. Yesterday morning, Senator Frist and Senator Daschle, Republican and Democrat, co-authored an editorial in the Washington Post on behalf of the Council on Election Integrity. They're part of it. So am I. So is Tim Romer, the Ambassador Tim Romer, Democrat, who co-chairs the Issue 1 Reformers Caucus with me. We've been very active for the last couple of months preparing the country for this period that we're going to go through where there's potentially on either side movement to call and question whether we can have confidence in this election. The states run the elections to the best of their ability. A lot of people during COVID need to vote by absentee ballot. We need to do it as best we can, and then we need to trust the system. We need to stay calm. We need to move through it. We don't need to declare victory until we know who won, and somebody's got to concede, and we've got to transfer power, and this nation has to come back together again between November 3rd and January the 20th. So that's job one right now, and then all these other things, we can get back to them. And Issue 1, for 4 years, I've co-chaired this Reformers Caucus. What is it? It's 203 former members of Congress, governors, cabinet secretaries in a very bipartisan coalition, pushing some of the same things that Senator Eldridge talked about, some of the same things that Jeff Clements talked about: transparency, ethics, accountability, enforcement. These are big, big issues. Let me hit on a few of these things. Listen, Citizens United was awful. I did a statewide press event with the late Fred Thompson, who was also a McCain ally, when Citizens United came down and the Supreme Court rulings around it. It wasn't just Citizens United, and said from this point forward, candidates for federal office are going to lose complete control of their own campaigns because all these outside groups are actually going to dominate the airwaves, dominate the messages, and candidates are going to be less influential. And we see that playing out in front of us. But as part of that, even, there were supposed to be some transparency rules and enforcement mechanisms, even behind Citizens United, none of which have been honored, none of which have been actually adhered to. The problem is we have zero enforcement of election laws today in America. Virtually at the federal level, there's no Federal Election Commission. They haven't had a quorum for like a year and a half. Both parties, frankly, are culpable here. Let me just talk a minute about that, because for the first 5 years of this mess of American politics post-Citizens United, everybody said this is a Republican problem. You know, they're the bad guys. They're the ones with all the dark money. Guys, the last 5 years, it's not even been close. Democrats are much more the dark money party than Republicans. And it's really just who's ever in power. or whoever might win power is going to get all the money. So that's the rottenness of this whole thing. It's not even ideological driven. It is selfish. It is what can we do to hold power? All policy in this country is now driven 2 years at a time over political cycles. Not what's good for the country long term, not what's good for Massachusetts long term, but what we can do to win this next election or to hold power. It's just a sick system. Very little transparency too. I mean, this whole notion of cooperation. Let's say that a super PAC, an outside group, has a family member running the super PAC and another family member running the campaign. And they're telling us there's no coordination between these two activities. And then there's no enforcement. So frankly, it's like the wild, wild west. There are no rules anymore in American politics. So a whole lot of things need to change. Over the long haul, we need civics education for our young people. That's a big issue, but we can't fix that tomorrow. But over the next 20 years, dadgummit, let's start training up the next generation on how this is supposed to function at the federal, the state, and the local level, and what the role of the government is supposed to be in our lives. Because right now, I'm telling you, there's way too many people out there that don't have a clue. And social media makes it all worse because a whole lot of what you see on social media is not even accurate. And then it goes from one person to another person to another person, and there's more confusion. The only way the president gets away with saying fake news is because there's so much fake information on both sides going everywhere that he can say fake news, and to his supporters, everything's fake. You know, and then what is truth? I mean, that may be, Dean, our biggest problem is nobody knows the difference between true and false anymore, and nobody knows what's accurate and inaccurate. So there's a big responsibility for all of us. Now, another big problem is under Article 1, the Congress, the first branch, is supposed to be a strong branch of the federal government. Let me tell you guys, in my adult lifetime, it has weakened to the point that it is basically AWOL. You know, we fund the government for 10 years by continuing resolution. What did they do yesterday? Punt all spending for another 10 weeks till December the 11th under a continuing resolution. Government by CR. The Congress is impotent. What happens when the Congress is impotent? The executive branch seizes more power. The judicial branch becomes actually more influential than it was ever supposed to be. Honestly, this is it's a balance of power issue. So I'm talking about some real big issues here. But I'll also tell you this, Matthew, and you pay attention to this, Sarah, you too. I think y'all are young enough to know. Our biggest challenge too is turning over power to your generation. I have much more faith in your generation than I do mine. My generation, baby boomers, are ground down to a frickin' halt. We are in our tribes. We're in our ditches. We're not coming out. We're going to blame the other team. The whole thing, our generation has failed America, period. I hate to say it, but it's true. I have much more hope in the next generation. They're not as partisan. They're not as tribal. They want to solve problems. And if you can use technology to your advantage and not your disadvantage, your generation has the potential of being a hero generation. So there's all kinds of solutions here. Let me give you one solution. Y'all said some things. In Tennessee, I think there's 10 states now, that you cannot raise money while the legislature is in session. Now in Tennessee, that's the second Tuesday until mid-May. You can't raise money. Now, that doesn't help the incumbents because they used to be able to have a fundraiser right while that legislation was on the floor, but they did it, and I'm telling you, it really cleans up some of this mess. I wish that in Congress, we could figure out a way that they don't go across the street and dial for dollars in the middle of a legislative day, because that is not only a corrupting thing, that is awful. I mean, the people that are making the calls hate it, the people that are being called hate it, the American people hate it, and you say, why does it continue? And it's this fear, paranoia by the leadership of both parties that is somehow, if they lay down their weapons, it's like a nuclear war, they're somehow going to be weakened. But the truth is, everybody would still have to play by the same rules, but you would disconnect the money, Senator Eldridge, from the actual product. And right now, the money drives the product. The money drives the campaigns. The money drives everybody. And members of the U.S. House, particularly on these 2-year terms, and you know, it's another constitutional amendment, which is very hard to do. But I applaud you because, frankly, Citizens United is not going anywhere unless we do a constitutional amendment. It's institutionalized. Unless you amend the Constitution, ain't nobody going to move away from this problem now. And it is fundamental to any kind of honor and dignity in the American political process. In fact, confidence in all of it is so low now, you're never going to get back unless we just completely change the field of play. That's what the Constitutional Amendment would do. Now, I don't know all the details in your Constitutional Amendment, but just getting rid of Citizens United, big problem in American politics in the last 10 years. So that's a whole lot in a short amount of time. Dean, what questions you have?
Well, thanks. That was a lot. It was very rich and exciting and interesting. I'll give you a quick question and we'll have more time to talk. So a number of things you said struck me. I mean, the shirking of its responsibility by Congress in terms of our separation of powers, I think, is a very important and critical piece of your presentation. That I mean, that's something that, of course, here in the law school we talk about a lot with our students. You know, our system can't work well if the branches don't take on the responsibilities that have been set for them. But something that in the work that you're doing now has really struck me. There is clearly this extraordinary bipartisan recognition of the nature of a lot of these problems. But we don't seem to be, I think the average American is not hearing from a lot of these people sort of in that bipartisan way. I mean, these really prominent leaders, all of you have mentioned prominent people from across the parties who get this. But for some reason, that message of, hey, really thoughtful, committed people who care about this country are very upset about what's happening right now. How do we get that message out to the American people that, you know, this isn't just a problem that we grouse about at home? I mean, we're all really concerned. Would that have any impact, do you think, on how these issues might move forward?
Of course it would. And again, I think part of this is generational as well, because there's a bunch of new ways to communicate in the modern era that the new generation knows. You know, for instance, I don't agree with AOC, but if AOC and Dan Crenshaw, who some of y'all wouldn't agree with Dan Crenshaw, but he's got the largest Instagram following of any Republican, I guess, outside of the president, of anybody, like 3 million, and AOC is just a phenomenon. But the two of them, young Americans, one left, one right, they would sit down and solve these problems and work together a lot quicker than anybody in my age. And the country would pay attention to them, because where they are is in the social media world. They got a lot of followers. Both of them do. That could be transformative, Dean. You're not going to get it from the nightly news. You're not going to get it from the Fox News. I mean, people say Fox News. It's not news. That's propaganda. MSNBC is propaganda. Just about all the networks are just propaganda anymore. So how does that narrative get driven? And let's be honest, as long as Donald Trump is president, he's going to control every single media cycle, and nobody else gets to talk about anything. And if he's not getting it, he's going to find a way to get it, even if it's just, I'm going to be flamboyant and say something really crazy. I don't really mean it, but I'm going to get the news cycle back. We've had a hard time at Issue 1 driving these good solutions, Dean, while he's president, because he takes all the oxygen out of the whole country's air. And so things are going to go back to normal. These things run in cycles, but I believe it's generational. I believe social media is where a lot of people are now. The younger generation can help us with this, but the only way to do that is to give them power. When I say AOC, my Republican friends will say, well, don't give her a platform, because blah, blah, blah. But listen, guys, we've always had choices. People can make their own decision. I want all young Americans to get more attention, to have more power. Every cycle, I want more of them elected, because they actually know how to broadcast these things, Dean. The people in your law school, they enter the marketplace based on how they can communicate, and this becomes a transformative generational issue. But if these changes are not generational, they'll die with me, and I don't want them to die with me. I want them to live with my kids and my grandkids, and I don't care which party you're involved in or what your ideology is. We need active citizens. Good government requires active citizens, and we don't have that anymore.
Well, thanks so much. And I want to remind everyone on the heels of those comments that we we encourage folks to put questions in the Q&A because we want to have a discussion, particularly with our law students and that next generation out there. And another great representative of that generation is with us next. Let me welcome Sara Eskrich.
Thank you. I was just chatting to my fellow panelists. I can't believe I'm following that, Congressman. So thank you for your remarks. Incredibly powerful. Let me start with a quick clarification. So I'm here with you from Democracy Found. I'm the executive director of our organization. It's based in Wisconsin. So hello from Madison, Wisconsin. I also serve as senior advisor to Catherine Gale, who works on this topic of political innovation and focuses specifically on one solution, Final Five voting, we call it. So I'm going to very quickly walk you through that solution, which includes ranked choice voting, which is on your ballot in Massachusetts. I like to say in a few days, but really probably on your ballot that you're already starting to receive and fill out and turn back in. So let me move quickly into the overview of this, and then I can't wait to for our discussion because it's clearly going to be rich. So the problem that our solution is designed to address is this one, this non-intersecting Venn diagram that has been so well articulated by the congressman about this problem in Washington, D.C., that it's not broken, right? But it's actually fixed. It's doing what it's designed to do because there is no real intersection for elected officials between acting in the public interest and their likelihood of getting reelected in our current system. And that is in many ways by design. So that's crazy, right? That's not the point of public service. That's not why people should get into public service. So what I want to talk about today is how we can change that systemically to get to results and accountability, which are two things we are certainly not getting out of Washington, D.C. these days. So let me talk about two major structural problems that get in the way of these results and accountability that have to do with our voting system design itself. So I'm going to start with party primaries. So right now, most of our elections are really decided in the primary, where candidates are generally pulled further left and further right than their voters as a whole really want them to be. And over 80% of our races for Congress, the winner's already decided after the primary, right? Whoever makes it out of that primary is gonna win because of a lot of factors, some of which have been already addressed by my fellow panelists. And the problem that I want to bring up about party primaries is not just this low turnout and lack of competition problem, but how that party primary design extends to governing and the calculus that elected officials have to make when they are governing in DC. So imagine for a moment that you're former Congressman Wamp, but you've been elected, and you're looking at a compromise bill on some of the most complicated problems that we're facing as a country, right? Take immigration, take healthcare, take anything that you care about as a policy issue that matters to you. And think about what you should ask yourself when considering whether or not you should vote on that bill, right? You might consider, is this bill a good idea? Is it the right policy for my country as a whole? Or even is it the right policy for my constituents in my district? But unfortunately, there's a question that elected officials, because of our system, have to ask themselves, which is, will I make it back through my party primary if I vote for this bill? And if the answer to that question is no, and let's be clear, on compromise legislation that's solving some of our most complicated problems in DC, the answer is almost always going to be no, because if you vote yes on that compromise, you're going to have a party primary challenger, either threatened or real, right? And you are going to have a system that dictates that you vote no on that compromise legislation, making it really hard for us to solve any of the problems that we need to solve. So that creates this problem of zero results out of Washington, D.C. I also said, right, there's no accountability for not getting those results in Washington, D.C. So One of the reasons that there's not accountability is because there's no competition. And we as customers, right, this work that I do is from a lens of business and industry competition, so I'll speak in those terms. But we as customers, as voters in this system, only have two choices. And again, the congressman really talked about this. In our system, right, in any other industry where customers only had two choices, but were as disgusted and disappointed with the results of those choices, we would have a new entrant to the marketplace, right? We would have something new that would be innovative and come in and offer us a new opportunity to get excited about something and respond to what we as customers, as voters really want. But we don't get that in politics because there are these structural barriers to entry that are way too high. And again, Senator Eldridge talked about this a little bit earlier, the structural barriers around how we vote, specifically our system of plurality voting. So when our country was young, there weren't a lot of examples of democracy, right? So we just put into place the system that was in place in Britain's countryside elections that said that the winner of elections should be the candidate who has the most votes, but not necessarily a majority of votes. They can just win with a plurality. So that means that in a three-way race, you can win with 34% of the vote. That's crazy. That means 66% of the electorate actually wanted someone else, but that person wins. So plurality voting is definitely not fair and it's definitely not representative, but it also creates this huge challenge around the spoiler effect and the wasted vote effect, which again, State Senator Eldridge already mentioned. Because we all know this, right? We've done it when we've gone into vote. We've looked at our ballot and we've been like, okay, I guess I'll vote for this person because I can't vote for the person I really like, because if I vote for them, I'm basically throwing my vote away, or I'm taking votes away from the person who I like all right, but it's actually going to elect the person I like the least. So we do these calculations all the time when we go vote strategically, because we don't want to vote for we don't want to throw our votes away. But I think even more importantly, really, than our current ballot is that we get the ballot that we get because the threat of spoiler and wasted vote arguments keeps new competition from putting their name on the ballot in the first place, right? People don't run as independents or third-party candidates because they know they're going to be spoilers. They know they're going to be wasted votes. So why would you even do that? So this is a really bizarre system, right? Where we are regularly told that we should have less competition and that that's better for us somehow as customers in this political system. But it doesn't have to be that way because we don't have to do elections through plurality voting. So there's two election reforms that we work on. We call it Final Five voting as a package, addressing that primary problem and the plurality voting problem. So the primary problem, we talk about it as top 5 primaries. So you go in and instead of having to choose whether you're going to take the Democratic ballot or the Republican ballot, you get one ballot with all of the candidates on it. And the top 5 vote getters out of that primary advance to the general election. And that sets up a system whereby we can use ranked choice voting in the general election to get to a candidate that we like the most and that has a true majority of support. So think about ranked choice voting this way. Think about when you look at your ballot, you get to say like, okay, I definitely know who my favorite candidate is, right? People know that. And then they've got a sense of like, all right, this person's all right, I guess. And if I have to vote for this person, I will. And then you definitely know who your over my dead body candidate is, right? People rank things in our lives all the time. And I think often actually do it when we look at our ballot. We just only have 2 choices in reality in our current system. So a ranked choice voting ballot shifts that. It takes those, in our system of Final Five voting, top 5 candidates from the primary, regardless of party affiliation, and allows you to vote for your favorite candidate. Told you I'm from Wisconsin, so we always use sports teams on our ballots so that people can get excited, but not, partisan ire coming up. So I'm going to vote for the Green Bay Packers. Sorry. A little dangerous to say that in Patriots territory. I know, I used to live in Boston, but I'm gonna vote for the Packers and they're my first choice. And I can stop there if I want to. But I can also go on, and my ballot will still count. If I vote for my first place vote and stop, my ballot still counts in a ranked choice voting election. But I can also tell you who I would also be okay with, who I would be all right with, and then who I definitely don't want to win. And what that system sets up is it sets up a way in which we count those first place votes first. And if someone gets a true majority, they win, the election's over. But if no one gets a majority from first place votes alone, we drop the lowest place candidate and they're essentially out of the election, right? And anyone who voted for them can have their second place vote counted. And that process of instant runoffs, right? It's essentially instant runoff elections, continues until you get to a candidate who has the broadest appeal to the most voters. So that in and of itself is pretty revolutionary, right? Getting to a candidate who has majority support and represents their district well. But I want to tell you that one of the reasons that I think RCV and our work focuses on this final 5 voting package together is that it changes the calculus for governing. So under this new system of final 5 voting, that Venn diagram for elected officials can intersect. It can create an incentive for elected officials to act in the public interest and still be able to get reelected in this system. They can do the things that we need them to do to move our country forward. Because under the old system, right, they had to look at that compromise legislation and think like, oh man, I'm not gonna make it out of my primary if I voted for this. And that's torn apart in this new system, right? You're gonna make it through a primary if you're an incumbent in a top 5 primary. And then in a general election with ranked choice voting, you can build a coalition of support to win. You can get first and second place and even maybe third place votes. So you can take some of those more difficult votes as an elected official. And if you're still doing a good job and broadly representing the will of your constituents, you still have a chance to get reelected. So I'll maybe stop there in terms of explaining the policy, but I just want to highlight the power of this change, because when you think about it for federal elections, we don't have to pass it in 50 states to start making a difference. If just a handful of states changed the way they run elections, Massachusetts is already on your way with ranked choice voting this November. We could get a fulcrum, right, of 5 states electing their senators. That's 10 senators in the US Senate to create a problem-solving coalition that can govern, that can solve some of these complicated issues by compromising, which is actually what the majority of Americans want their elected officials to do. But by changing these election incentives, we free them up to take those votes in the way that we want them to take those votes. So again, I'm going to stop there and we can dive in for more questions, but that's the policy background. And I'm happy to talk more about the campaign in Massachusetts. I've been serving as a bit of an advisor and fundraiser to that campaign for the past few years. And I know State Senator Eldridge has been super involved as well, but also happy to talk about this concept of final 5 voting and the work that we're doing in a legislative state of Wisconsin to pass this, because half the states don't have ballot initiatives, right? And so we've got to do it through legislation. So it's going to look different state by state how we get this implemented.
Well, thank you so much. I, for one, want to in particular thank you for the final 5 explanation, because I hadn't heard a lot about that. And it actually, when you pair that with ranked choice voting, it really completes the picture in a way that I don't know if people have often heard. So thanks for that. So let me ask a quick question. So we in Massachusetts, as you mentioned, are in the position of having this choice, at least on the ranked choice voting part. And we've been able to watch our neighbor to the north in Maine, watch the process there. And one thing that happened there was that there were some challenges to opening up ranked choice voting to the citizens of Maine. One of them being people are going to be too confused, and this is going to undermine democracy. What kinds of challenges do you anticipate, and is there any among them? Are there any among them that, or is there one that you find might be particularly challenging going forward?
Yeah, the top concern is that concern around it's too complicated for voters. And I believe that is a farce. That is underestimating our electorate, because they do know, right? We rank things in our lives all the time. We decide that, you know, if I can't have pizza for dinner tonight, then I guess I'll have Chinese food. But if I can't get that, then I'm gonna, right? Like, we go through and we make these decisions. To say that we can't do that about who we're electing to represent us is short-sighted, and it underestimates voters, which I think is a disservice to them. Furthermore, we have seen in Maine in early adoption, right? They just passed this in 2019 and continue to vote in favor of this. The people of Maine continue to reaffirm their support for ranked choice voting in Maine, but they do it. They rank their choices. They go through and they express their preference. And in exit polling, they say they really appreciate that opportunity. So we do know that voters, they can do this and they will do it, and they will like doing it. Because a lot of times I think we talk about, you know, disengagement of the voting electorate and how do we get more people to vote? And we do all these things to try to get people to vote, but we don't think about fundamentally one of the reasons that people don't want to vote is because they don't feel like it's making a difference. And it's hard to say this, but sometimes that's true, right? Sometimes your vote really isn't going to change who gets elected in our current system. But you all in Massachusetts have the opportunity to redesign that system in a way that your vote matters no matter where you live. That's incredibly powerful towards energizing an electorate to get involved and vote and feel that empowerment that their vote is actually going to make a difference. And I don't think we talk about that enough in the electoral reform community, that systems and structural changes can also have an impact on this disengaged, polarized, checked out, you know, frustrated electorate that the congressman talked so much about. These changes could make a big difference in that realm.
Thanks so much. And I think that's a great point to pivot on. You know, there is really a sense amongst many people in this country that, you know, their participation is futile or it doesn't matter. And that has to be corrected if we're going to heal our democracy. So let me open up a question for the entire panel, and then I'll throw out any other questions that show up in the chat. But I'll start with this one. So we've talked a lot about various types of reforms, but one thing we didn't really talk about are some of the impediments to actual participation, like the difficulties many people in this country have just voting. You know, it doesn't matter what type of system. There are really very serious impediments across the country that make voting a lot more difficult than it has to be. Is there a sense in the reform community about how that issue might intersect with some of the other more particular issues each of you is working on? And do you have any thoughts sort of on voter accessibility in general as part of or packages of reform? Anyone can jump in. You can raise your hand like this, or you can raise your virtual hand. Go ahead, Senator.
Yeah, thanks, Dean Rougeau. I mean, I would say, you know, it's a reminder that, you know, in Massachusetts, which is known as a very blue state, but you know, sort of to what both Sara and Congressman Wamp had highlighted, is that it's the major political parties not wanting, you know, progress on making it, in this case, to your question, you know, making it easier for people to vote. You know, we've had a bill for same-day election registration in Massachusetts probably for 20 years. I thought we had a chance to pass it this year as a result of the pandemic, but it did not pass as part of a reform package we did to make it easier to vote by mail. And yet the legislation that we did pass, allowing basically sort of lowering the threshold, if you will, for ballots to be mailed from home, is that what happened is the biggest primary turnout, mostly on the Democratic side, but the biggest primary turnout in 2 decades in almost every community. So I think that speaks to the fact that if you make it, you know, if you make voting more accessible to voters, that they will get out and vote. But that was, the only reason the legislature made that change was specifically because of COVID. We could not get, same day election registration passed. There were, still some questions about, access to the polls from a public health point of view, that we didn't do enough to make sure people felt comfortable. And still just not enough information out there to guide voters. One of the interesting analyses on the Ed Markey, Joe Kennedy race was that because it was such a high profile race, you had a lot more quote unquote low information voters. And, I think the question is, how do we better, educate voters so that, they're more informed on the different, choices? Because while that, had a certain outcome in the US Senate race, a lot of down ballot races, state legislative races, there was a sense that it led to, a lot of great candidates who ran, but because there were so many new voters coming in, but they had trouble communicating their message to those new voters. And so we really have to find a way to change that as well. So that's sort of my perspective in Massachusetts.
Oh, okay. Yes, Representative Wamp.
Let me just add, unfortunately, we don't change in this country until there's a crisis. We're not going to deal with a debt until we have a complete collapse. 2008 was an example of that. So what creates the crisis where we'd see change in this space? Well, COVID is a crisis that affects our elections. Some of the things we've actually clarified this year, which we didn't know, issue one's really involved in this space. We advocated for the $400 million, the federal government, while they're just borrowing money blindly, to give to the states, because most of the states say, we got this covered, we're okay. And then when all of a sudden they don't have any money, they go, well, now wait a second. But even then there's a disconnect, Senator, between what the local election commission says and what your state director of your elections say. Because the state's going to say, we got it covered, and the local guys are saying, we don't, you got to help us. And the federal government's got a role to play, even though the states carry out the elections. But here's one of the changes. Okay, this is just me now, okay? I'm not speaking for issue one. Except that we have advocated that in this country, COVID is an example, everybody in this country in every state really needs to have the ability to vote absentee by request, regardless of their age, from here on, because it makes sense. And early voting, which we have in our state, is a great way to get half of this out of the way before you ever get to the melee of election day. And so there are reforms that we now know are justified. I believe now we've seen, and this is where the president, his bully pulpit, he got people confused talking about voting by mail. And then also when they said, well, you vote absentee, then he drew the difference. And the difference is an absentee vote is you request it yourself and you get it and you get to vote absentee. Vote by mail in, there's like 9 states that send everybody. Actually, I'll tell you right now, a little ad. We have a podcast, issue one, called swampstories.org. The 17th podcast this year is on this issue. You've got great information. Go there, and it really clarifies. There's 9 states that just send ballots to all registered voters. 9. There were only 5. 4 have been added this year, but 41 states don't do that. And that's really what President Trump's been railing about, is don't send ballots to everybody because you can't keep track of those ballots coming back in. If somebody shows up to vote in person, that happened in Georgia, that's sort of a mess. But being able to ask for a ballot yourself as a registered voter and get one to vote absentee, that ought to be universal, regardless of age, especially in the world now where we've got all these threats. This is a real reform, Dean, that can help participation. Voting early. Let's give them as many options as possible. We're always going to have a debate about same-day registration because that's hard to document who's doing it right then and there. Some of these are ideological. I get it. But there's a whole bunch of easy things that we ought to all be able to agree to if we can just speak in truth to each other.
Thanks so much. Okay, we're running out of time, but I'm gonna propose a way to wrap things up. I'm gonna try to bundle a couple of questions, and I'm gonna sort of round robin and ask each of you to respond as you see fit to my bundle. You can take a piece of it, or you can quickly quickly go through each of them. But the other thing I would invite the panelists to do, if you go into the Q&A, you may be able, there are some very specific questions that may benefit from a specific answer from you, sort of directed to your area of expertise. So either you can, write a quick reply, or you can connect with that person offline. So let me do this. So there are several questions that are really around what I wanted to end with, which is how do students, law students, undergraduates, young people get involved? Can you give them some concrete ways to, get engaged with the issues that you're working on and to be a part of the process of reform in this country? Another question I'll bundle with that, because one or two of you may have a thought on it, is, obviously we don't have to reinvent the wheel, because there are lots of countries that have democratic voting systems and they're different from ours. Are there any, and they often have different, and some might say sometimes better or more democratic results. Are there any countries that you look to as great examples of how we might try to structure reform, or where we can draw ideas? So I'll throw those two big questions out. And Sara, I'll start with you. And after Sara goes, I'll just identify another person. But again, if you see something you want to answer in the chat, jump in and do that. And I want to, before we go there, to just offer my heartfelt thanks for what has been such an extraordinarily rich conversation. It's been a great pleasure for me to be the moderator. So Sara, what are your thoughts on those?
I'll echo that, and thanks for your good questions too, Dean. So you all are in Massachusetts. You have an opportunity to get involved right now by voting for the Yes on 2 amendment and getting your friends and family to vote. I used to live in Massachusetts. My husband's from there, and I had my brother-in-law said to me recently, Sara, my friends were complaining about this election, because everybody's complaining about the top of the ticket, I think, cross-partisan, this election, especially after this week. And he said, I was so excited that I could say, yeah, but don't vote because of that. Vote because on our ballot, we've got this question where we can change our electoral system so we aren't faced with this ridiculousness into the future, right? Sometimes we put so much emphasis on the presidential races that, to the congressman's point, we've completely neglected the other branches of government who should be doing their job, and we should be holding them accountable for that. And so that is a really powerful way to engage in this electoral season, where often it feels so frustrating and it feels like the conversation that you just don't want to have because it's so depressing. Remember that now you have something to contribute that's positive and empowering and exciting and could actually make a difference. So in the short term, right, in the next days, weeks, do that. Because it is incredibly powerful. And Massachusetts and Alaska are going to lead our country on election systems reforms this cycle. So that is a concrete thing that you can do. I'll also just say very briefly, someone mentioned in the chat this piece around, the congressman was talking about, how do we cycle in the next generation? And often people talk about term limits and as a tool, a policy tool to create more change in our elected officials. And I want to offer, sometimes that can be a kind of a controversial one. I want to offer that accountability in election structures, having more competitive elections through tools like Final Five voting and ranked choice voting itself, can create that accountability structurally in a way that is frankly a little bit, I would argue, even more accountable than term limits as a solution. So again, think about how these things have bigger effects on the changes that you might want to see, because all these, we're talking about a lot of things that all work together to make really important changes to our political system, which in and of itself is just, again, empowering to think that we can innovate in our political system. And gosh, we have to, if we want to protect this democracy moving forward. So I'll stop there.
Thanks so much. Jeff, Clements.
Thank you, Dean. Thanks to everybody. Very quickly, I think on the how do other countries do it? No country in the world as far as I know, and feel free to correct me if I'm wrong, but no country in the world believes that unlimited money is an unlimited free speech right to be used in the political process. There's no more efficient way to allocate political power based on wealth than that doctrine in the First Amendment. And that's why $60 billion has come into the political system since the Citizens United decision. It's why the vast majority of Americans feel voiceless and unrepresented. And so, many countries have limits around the money in their political system not because they're violating anyone's free speech, or because they're protecting the equal rights of their citizenry. And I think we need to do the same. That's why we need a constitutional amendment, which will get me to my second point. And I'm in Massachusetts. I will be voting yes on 2 and encourage everybody else to as well. If we're allowed to give issue endorsement like that, I'm personally voting for it. So thank you, Sarah. But on this constitutional amendment, it's real time. It's now. And so to the law students who are saying, what can I do? Vote yes on 2, but believe, don't let, I agree with Congressman Wamp on everything he said, and particularly don't let our generation tell you can't do constitutional amendments. Don't let our generation tell you, you can't limit money in politics. It's just the way it is. Believe in this project of America. Believe in your power as your privilege as lawyers and law students, and serve. Service is citizenship. It's not just for lawyers. Run for office, run for local office. I retired undefeated after 5 years of service in a local office, unlike the esteemed senator and congressman on this panel. But some of my best legal work ever that I enjoyed the most, didn't make a dime, but I was as an assistant attorney general litigating with tobacco companies or working on climate. You got to believe, and don't just, I know you're not going to, but I was a big firm partner too, and that's fun and interesting, and you make more money, but you got to serve, you got to believe. Sign up at AmericanPromise.net, AmericanPromise.net, get more facts, stay in touch, and thanks to all of
Senator Eldridge.
Yeah, thank you, Dean. I would just to touch upon what Jeff said and what you asked as far as young people, is that I do really think it's important for law students or young lawyers to really get involved in your community and raise these issues about all the systemic barriers to improving our democracy, to passing common sense policy. Because when I talk to law students, and I actually participated in the BC Law Public Interest Retreat this past weekend, is that I know that most law students, most lawyers, they probably are not looking to run for the legislature, whether state or federal. But to run for in Massachusetts, it's Board of Selectmen or Select Board, for City Council, other local positions, to serve on a board of directors, or an organization, or to get involved in civic groups like the one that the congressman leads and Sara leads in Wisconsin. Is that I think the challenge I find is that often in an election year, the transparency, the campaign finance, the voting issues are not always the top priority for voters. I hope that changes, but how that in part changes is to get more young people, more law students who are passionate about this, to be in leadership positions, whether it's a municipal government, whether it's a nonprofit or civic group, to prioritize this. Because I will say that I talked to a lot of my colleagues who have co-sponsored ranked choice voting or co-sponsored public finance, but behind the scenes they don't really see how it makes a change. I think they're sort of, to Sarah's point, they feel pressure from a particular partisan point of view to sign on to this legislation, but they're not passionate about it. So people who are passionate about it, need to be vocal, need to be more active, to talk about, unless we, pass this common sense piece of legislation, we're not going to make the progress that the vast majority of people want to see in our society. So that's really what I would encourage, young people and law students to think about. And certainly that's, what I did in law school, and it led to, very fortunately myself to have a chance to run for office. But even if you don't want to run, you can play a really key role.
Thanks so much. Mr. Wamp, we'll close with you.
So information is power. We're in the information age. All young people who care about public service or having any involvement in the future need to saturate themselves with good information. We talked today about how much bad information is out there. So find sources of honest information and saturate yourself in them. The people who are the most effective now in politics and government are not the best looking or the coolest. They're the ones that have the most information. Knowledge for your work is important. Senator Eldridge is going to tell you in Massachusetts, if there's a subject matter expert in the Senate, everybody goes to them on that topic. Why? Information is power. Second thing, as Jeff said, my daughter is a lawyer. She was 3 years public defender, 3 years assistant DA. Now she's general counsel for our large sheriff department here. She is not making any money to speak of. She's paying her bills. That's about it. But man, she is serving in a very effective role in all of those positions and gaining that experience. You need to do the same thing. Open up all the opportunities by serving. Don't be motivated by how much money you make, because frankly, that's a dead-end street. It's a dead-end street. What's not is build a foundation. The money will come. That's what Jeff said. 2 good ideas on limits that I think other countries do well. The parliamentary governments of Australia, which is one of my favorite places, been there 4 times, they have limits on campaign season. The prime minister says, boom, the election begins. You can't campaign before it. You can't raise money. You can't go on TV and talk about your reelection until the season starts and the season ends. We are consumed 24/7, 365, all the time. All these networks raise all this money, keeping us fighting with each other. We ought to have campaign seasons so that the American people can only tolerate it so much. Secondly, we ought to have federal dollars only raised from the state from which you run. Think about it. Only come from the state. If you're doing business in Oklahoma, you can give to the Oklahoma senators. But if you're not, and you're not an Oklahoma interest, that's one way to limit it and really reduce it. And I know there's pushback on all these fronts. The media is not going to want the campaign season because they can't drive the dollars. But we ought to have a bloodless revolution in this country of the people saying, like y'all are doing with your constitutional amendment, this is good policy. We're going to fight for it. So young people, it's up to you. We're not leaving you a very pretty picture, but this is still the land of opportunity. I mean, this is still the greatest place in the world, but it's not going to be unless y'all step into the role of leading and solving problems. And thank you for letting me be a part of it.
Well, thank you to all of our panelists once again. It has been an extraordinary pleasure to be with you here this afternoon. I know all of us at the BC law community and across Boston College have learned a lot from this discussion, and I hope it's giving folks a bit of hope about the future and a sense of how they might engage going forward. And finally, let me end by once again thanking the Clough Center for their support and thanking Matt, Victor, and the entire group of students with the Good Governance Project, a great example of young people taking the bull by the horns and engaging in some serious action to help improve our democracy. Have a great afternoon, everyone. Thanks once again.